campus, and my next door neighbor, office-wise, Randy Hillebrand, said to me, "How'd you like to come to Rome for a month in the summer and help us run a class?" And I of course jumped at the opportunity, and I was tasked with the role of helping to create a class that would bring TV and film students together along with public relations students to do a project that they could earn credit for and while they're studying abroad. So we set out to find an NGO that we could work with when we got to Rome, and we somehow found Shoot for Change. It was through a mutual colleague. And what a great bunch of guys they turned out to be. They are photographers and videographers who inspired us to get a little bit more involved, get a little bit out of our comfort zone, learn how to engage using pictures and video and words in order to make our lives a little bit more fulfilled and other people's lives a little bit more comfortable. We are very lucky people. Today we all woke up in a bed. We'll probably all have 3 or more meals. We'll be comfortable in the safety of our surroundings. These guys don't always wake up in a nice soft bed. They go out and get into the middle of danger. They get out of their comfort zones to tell the stories of hungry people, of opposed people, of disenfranchised people. And it's been a wonderful experience working with them. The great sage, the media sage, Noam Chomsky said, "Changes in progress very rarely are gifts from above. They come out of struggles from below." And I feel that the folks who are here today, including our keynote speaker, are the folks in the trenches, the folks who are working to help other people have better lives. I'm very honored to introduce former New York City Council Speaker Melissa Mark-Viverito. She was the first Puerto Rican woman and Latina elected to serve as a council member for the 8th District. As a council member from 2006 to 2017, she was a leading voice in the Latino community, and in January of 2018, she joined the Latino Victory Fund, a political action committee aimed at improving Latino representation all across the country. As the senior advisor for the organization, she assists with recruiting leaders, expanding fundraising activities, increasing public involvement. In addition to her personal life, Melissa Mark-Viverito is active in community affairs. She's traveled to Puerto Rico a number of times in the aftermath of the Hurricane Maria to help with relief efforts. She's also a founding member of the Women of El Barrio, and served as chair of the Violence Intervention Program, and as a board member representing New York for the I'm going to mispronounce that. Barichua? How did I? Baricua initiative, thank you. She's also a media activist. She served as a producer and a radio host. She's been very involved with New York City's largest circulating Spanish language newspaper, El Diario, La Prensa. She was also a delegate to the World Conference Against Racism in South Africa in 2001 and the International Women's Conference in China in 1995. She is in the trenches. Melissa was born and raised in San Juan, Puerto Rico. She earned a BA in political science from Columbia and a Master of Public Administration from Baruch College. And we're thrilled to have her here at Hofstra University today. So let me introduce our keynote speaker, Melissa Mark-Viverito.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to wake up a little bit. Good afternoon. So to Professor Morisoff, thank you so much for the introduction. I want to thank Dean Kornag, Professor Hillebrand, Atheline, and everybody all the students I know that put this conference together. I hear it's the first time that you're doing this, and hopefully you will be inspired and motivated to continue to do this moving forward. And I sat in a little bit on the panel before lunch and was very inspired by the work that is happening and the motivation, right, that resulted in this chapter being founded here in New York. I am truly at my core, even though I was 12 years in politics, at my core I've always been and continue to be an activist. And I believe very much that we need to be engaged and involved to produce the change that we want to see in the world. And we are living in very, very difficult times at this moment. But being Puerto Riqueña, being a Latina, and coming to New York City at the age of 18 to go to college and figure out what I wanted to do with my life, one of the things that I've always been motivated by is the activism that I grew up around and the activism that I've seen that has led to the change that we wanted to see, right? Whether it's the women's feminist movement and the reproductive rights that we've gained, which are perilously at stake right now, or whether it was the student movement, right, during the Vietnam era. There are really cycles of struggle, and the civil rights movement, and the Dreamers, and the Black Lives Matter. I mean, we see cycles of activism that really moves the dial. And so I wanted to just share some words, and then I also would like to open it up for conversation, because I think the real value in these opportunities is to exchange ideas and any questions that people may have about the work that we engage in. But as an activist and becoming an elected official, what I wanted to see was, how do I utilize the platform that I had before me, which was being a legislator, eventually becoming the Speaker of the New York City Council, to produce change, to move the dial, right? When you're a legislator, you make the laws. We were making the laws for the city of New York. We adopted the budget for the city of New York. How do we utilize that opportunity to enact change? And that is a very significant and really important and very humbling experience. So I'll just address it with some words, but definitely would like an opportunity to engage with all of you. So I do want to thank again also all the staff and the workers here who put these conferences together, because we know a lot of times they're behind the scenes. Así que gracias a todos for that. So immigrants or refugees, each of these words in their own unique way conjures different pictures for different people. For some, it is a family leaving Syria, fleeing famine and poverty, and fleeing a violent civil war in search of Europe. For others, it could be the Irish fleeing famine and poverty, arriving at Ellis Island with little more than they could carry. And yet for others, it could be the Puerto Rican family abandoned by the government after Hurricane Maria, flying on JetBlue to Orlando. Or it could be the child from El Salvador showing up at the US border, alone, scared, and desperate to escape the violence in his or her country. While their stories may be different, their routes varied, and their paths separate, they do share one thing in common: hope. Hope is what drives people to leave their homes. Hope is what sustains them on their journeys. Hope is their future. The lives of immigrants and refugees is driven by hope. Indeed, the story of our country is one driven by this hope. Go back and read what George Washington said from Valley Forge, or what Frederick Douglass said, fighting for emancipation, or what Cesar Chavez said about justice. Their causes, tactics, and beliefs may have varied, but what tied them together was hope for a better world. Today, these principles find themselves under attack. Rather than opening ourselves up as beacons of hope and justice, we're trying to close ourselves off. Instead of serving as a North Star for the people of the world who are downtrodden or oppressed, we are turning our backs. It's not just who we are or who we want to be. One of the lines I often used in 2014, 15, and 16 during my State of the City speeches was that we were never more than one election away from losing everything we've built. While we have made progress, it was fragile and could be taken back at a moment's notice. When the wind is at our backs, this warning seemed to at times fall on deaf ears. People would tell me I was being overly cynical, or that some of these forces aligned against us would never go as far as they told us they would. In retrospect, maybe we were underplaying the threats to our values and our democratic norms. But let's be explicitly clear. We are in an era of profound vulnerability, especially for our immigrant and refugee sisters and brothers and communities of color. Whether it is calls for Muslim bans, or calls for a national stop and frisk policy, or calls of American carnage, calls to end DACA, or the howls of fake news at the truth, we are in uncharted territory as a nation. Attacks on immigrants xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism happen regularly. Communities who need the most help are being excluded from conversations. In Puerto Rico, millions are desperate for help. It is an exhausting daily drumbeat of incompetence, racism, corruption, and lies. The sheer scale is nearly unimaginable, and it is hard to put into words just how deep it goes. And I don't know about all of you, but every day seems like a week. Every week seems like a month, and every month seems like a year. Faced with this attack on our values, we face two options: silence or activism. And I'm proud that we have chosen activism. Since January of last year, millions have taken to the streets. We've marched for women. Anybody here go to any of the women's marches? Raise your hands. We've marched for science and reason. There was that march for science, right, when reason and science are under attack. We've marched against guns and gun violence. Who participated in any of those rallies? We've marched against the structural racism that plagues our criminal justice system and against police shootings that have claimed too many black and brown lives. We've marched to say loudly and clearly that black lives matter. And we've marched and protested to say no to Muslim bans, no to walls, that we are better as a nation, as a people, when we are welcoming, when we are accepting, and when we are empathetic. This mass awakening of American activism is truly staggering in its scope. According to a poll that was released a few weeks ago by the Washington Post Kaiser Family Foundation, tens of millions of Americans have gone to a protest or political rally since the beginning of 2016. About 1 in 5. Of those people who protested, nearly 20% said that they had never been to a similar event before. 20%. These are numbers we have not seen in a generation and rival other periods of our history when we've been faced with stark choices and our values. The question then is, what do we do with this newfound activism? And how do we translate it not just into action, but real sustainable change? Part of that starts with understanding that while Washington matters, and it does, elections matter, we also can take things into our own hands at the local level. They can threaten us, they can sue us, but they can't take away our agency to act. And they did that to us in New York City. The federal government had threatened us and wanted to sue us. At the local level, as a city council speaker, we took major steps to protect and defend immigrants and vulnerable populations. And in the process, showed how cities and municipalities can be dams against the tide of racism and xenophobia that comes from Washington. They can build their walls, but within our cities, we can create an oasis of justice. On criminal justice reform, we acknowledged the structural racism that persisted top to bottom, that for too long targeted communities of color, and we did something about it. Recognizing that too many people were being caught up in the dragnet of low-level crimes, like being in the park after dark or drinking on your stoop, we passed landmark legislation called the Criminal Justice Reform Act that lowered penalties for low-level, nonviolent crimes. A criminal record for something as small as that, those items, those infractions that I mentioned, could lead to a lifetime of difficulty, harming people's chances to get a job or to get a home. This meant thousands of people were walking, I just lost my place. This is the thing about technology, I'm not used to using these. Sorry, give me a second, I'm almost there. So so when we talk about those infractions and people that were in New York City, that were being handcuffed and jailed for low-level infractions, think about that. If you have a criminal record, the implications that that has to your life, being able to get a job, and as I mentioned, housing. This meant that thousands of people were walking around New York City with criminal records that threw up too many obstacles for a better future. And we changed that. And tens of thousands, particularly men of color, have benefited. We also recognize that Rikers Island, our most notorious jail, was a key component of the structural racism that we were fighting. So I convened a commission with former New York State Chief Judge Jonathan Lippman to explore how we could close Rikers Island. So today I'm proud to say that we're on a path to doing just that, and sometime in the not too distant future, Rikers Island will close for good. This is what can happen when we mobilize behind a cause, bring people together, and fight for what is right. And we did the same thing on immigration. With Washington sitting on its hands, we took matters into our own. We passed a landmark municipal ID program for everyone, regardless of your status. For many, this will be the first ID and will give them access to city services and many other benefits. We also passed 2 bills that significantly limited the city's cooperation with ICE in the enforcement of civil immigration laws. These bills prohibit the Department of Correction and the Police Department from honoring civil immigration detainer requests issued by ICE unless a federal judge issues a warrant and the subject of the detainer has been convicted of a violent or serious crime or is a possible match on a terrorist watch list. New York City had no business expending scarce resources assisting in the enforcement of broken immigration laws, and Congress wouldn't act, so we decided to do so. In addition to reducing the number of ICE civil detainer requests the city honors, we also removed ICE offices from Rikers Island, and we will no longer give ICE special access to those being held on Rikers Island. We also created a historic public-private partnership to fund lawyers for New York City's unaccompanied minors. After touring the search docket and seeing the level of despair, sadness, and hopelessness that some of these children faced, I knew that we needed to act. These are children who were coming on their own, some 12 years old, some 10 years old, who were crossing the border because violence was so pervasive in their countries, and their parents were so afraid, and we're seeing some of that conversation happening now as well, that they would let them go on their own because the options at home were ones that they just were not willing to take the risk of putting them. So we had children that were coming on their own, and we needed to provide them with some legal assistance so that they could claim asylum. So one of the things that we did as a city, and I was very proud, is that we took $1 million of funds from the city of New York and designated them for immigration services, and particularly legal services. And we teamed up with foundations in order to fund it. It became a $2 million program. It's actually one that other cities have looked to model. And again, it's something about stepping up into a moment of need and figuring out how we can demonstrate leadership despite all the odds that are coming at us. We saw a crisis, we got creative, and we solved it. And then looking at young women of color. We knew that young women of color were facing obstacles and challenges. We created the first in the nation Young Women's Initiative, aimed at closing the gender gap and empowering young women. And talking about Equal Pay Day today, very relevant, that we're talking about figuring out ways how do we eliminate the barriers and the structural barriers that young women of color in particular have that was preventing them from being able to fulfill their potential. So again, how the government can take action to really address a need that exists. So we had basically designated about $5 million in city funds in order to look at these issues and provide and implement policies to try to break those barriers down. We've also passed legislation. We passed legislation to collect disaggregated data on sexuality and gender identity, something that is very important. The Asian Pacific American community, and multiracial New Yorkers. When we get an understanding of the population that we represent, there's a way that we can really make sure public policy is more effective. So the idea of gathering data, and again, people that self-identify, people could decide not to opt in and opt out, but information that would be very critical for us as policymakers. So this is what happens, you know, these kinds of policies. This is what happens when women and women of color not only have a seat at the table, but are leading it. And so these are just a few examples of what we can do at the local level to bring change. And while cities and municipalities can lead, we also must recognize that this leads to imbalances across the country. An unaccompanied minor in Long Island is treated differently than one just a few miles away in Queens. A low-level arrest in the Bronx is a different one than in Yonkers. And women of color in New York City have access to different supports than young women in Nassau. In each instance, what led to these changes was activism. And while I was an elected official, I came from the world of activism. I thought of myself as an activist, and I still do. It's activists who lay down the groundwork, and it is activists who hold us accountable, and activists who raise our awareness. We don't fully know what the future holds anymore. The guardrails are off. Really, who knows what could have happened in these last 20 minutes that we're in this room? I haven't checked my Twitter, which is a way that I get my information a lot of times, and so we don't know what could have happened in the last 20 minutes. That's how tenuous the times we are living right now. But I know this. Today, we need activists more than ever. We need their voices to be loud, clear, and brave, and we have seen that. As I mentioned before, Black Lives Matter, the Dreamers, the Parkland activists, those are all young people that are leading that cause and that are now uniting, and this conversation about intersectionality, how all of our communities relate to each other, and that we need to find commonality in our struggles, is the way that we're able to move forward. So, in some ways, we may have been complacent about our democracy. Maybe we took it all a little bit for granted, that our leaders would act in good faith. But clearly, we were wrong. And it's on us to basically fight back and reclaim that democracy. So I'll leave my comments that. I mean, again, I want to thank you for inviting me. I want to thank the group that has formed, around this Shoot for Change. I think in terms of what you're seeing is the use of media as a way of, I think, sharing experiences, of gaining insight, I'm hoping that empathy, right, is something that can result of that, with understanding our own struggles and trying to understand the struggles of others, is the way that we build a better future. We have to get out of our silos. We get into our comfort zones. We don't talk to people beyond our immediate network, right? And somehow technology can be very empowering, but can also be very isolating. And so we have to figure that out. So I think programs like this, from what I'm picking up and from what I saw, is really a powerful tool that can have us understand the greater world around us and the challenges that exist and how they relate to each other. Because we talked, right, we saw about the refugees coming from Africa and going into Italy, right, and going into Europe. But we're talking about the child from Honduras, from Guatemala, El Salvador, right, that are coming over the border fleeing violence. And it's similar, right, in those struggles. But the realities are just a little slightly different. So, oh, Ravi's here. I saw that Ravi's there. You have a great activist that you're going to hear from later on, Ravi Ragbir, who's a great activist and a friend. So, but I'll leave it there. I don't know if, I would love to, if anybody has questions or engage in any way, I think that's the best that we could do with the rest of our time.
My name is Ryan Mcdonald. I am a graduate student in PR here and a member of helping put this together. Thank you so much for coming. I actually just wanted to ask, in your history, maybe what was the instance or the cause that triggered your activism, where you realized I am an activist, where you started to identify that way?
Well, I grew up in Puerto Rico, and my mother was a young mother. I mean, I think by the age of 24, she had the three of us. She was going to college. She was going to, grad school. She got her law degree. But she was an activist at that time. In the 70s, when I was growing up, that was the height of the feminist movement. And so the feminist movement in Puerto Rico was very active, and yet my mom was one of the leaders with many other women. So I was raised in an environment of women feeling empowered, fighting for their rights, that as a young girl, being raised by 20 other women, pretty much, I basically knew that there were no bounds for me. And I embraced that, and so that activism, although I didn't recognize it at the time, when I came to New York City and I started going to school and I started to see injustices, and I wasn't afraid to speak up, and I learned that from that experience. And so after, now that I've left public office, one of the things that I wanted to find was I wanted to be able to do work where I could continue to make this impact. So right now I'm working with Latino Victory Fund. As indicated, we are supporting Latino candidates who are running for office, particularly looking right now at the midterm elections to change the Congress to blue, right? And make sure that we reclaim at least one house, one chamber of Congress. So feeling very useful in that sense. And I'm also doing some work with regards to Puerto Rico after the hurricane and trying to create a coalition, national coalition to address the unfortunate lack of appropriate response from the federal government. But although that came from my upbringing, and a lot of times we don't recognize the impact that our upbringing has on us. But when we become older, we realize how it all comes full circle. And that's what happened. But thank you, yes.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Owen Lewis. I'm also in the graduate program in public relations here. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the role that cities could play in kind of mending some of the damage that people like Donald Trump have kind of done to the United States reputation internationally. Like, for example, his comments about Haiti and countries in Africa. So just what role cities can play in that regard.
I mean, look, the way I see it is that, you know, we have to become cities of resistance. And we are going to continue, right? When I was speaker, and I know that the mayor now continues to say that, and we are overwhelmingly a democratic and progressive city in New York, but being very clear that we're going to continue to embrace our values. And, you know, the best example is always modeling. And unfortunately, we have a bad example in the White House that's modeling behavior which is deplorable and is embarrassing and is putting us very much at risk. It's a very dangerous time, particularly for communities of color, and we know for our Muslim brothers and sisters, it's very, we've seen a rise in hate crimes, we've seen an increase in the number of families being ripped apart. There's a lot of peril here. So we are going to continue, and we have to continue to demand that our elected officials demonstrate and embrace the values that we uphold, despite the risks. As I indicated, you know, we consider ourselves, and I know Ravi has a real particular view on it, but you know, I would like us to see ourselves as a sanctuary city, right? That we have implemented policies that continue to demonstrate that we value diversity, that we embrace our immigrant brothers and sisters, despite your status. And we have programs in place, like I mentioned, that we've invested money in to reflect those values, and we've been threatened. The city of New York has been threatened by the federal government because we continue to embrace those policies. So we've got to demand of our elected officials that they do not buckle, right, that they do not fold. We see some great leadership coming out of California. I mean, they have been unbelievable, you know, and we need to continue to do that. So, and the idea of building coalitions with other like-minded cities and building some sense of resistance, right, a wall of resistance of these cities that are saying no. You know, we're not going to accept what you're asking, what you're demanding of us. We're going to do things in a different way and finding out, although it comes at risk. We've seen money, resources, right, that are going to be taken away from the city and the state. And that puts the people that we represent in a difficult position. So I think that we have to model, and we continue to model, despite the odds, what we would like to see and demand in others. And I think that that sense of empathy and collegiality and solidarity is important in this time. And so the idea of, as a Latina, right, that was born a U.S. citizen, but one of the issues I feel most passionately about is this issue of immigration reform. Right? I'm passionate about human rights and civil rights, so, you know, I'm an ally and to the LGBT community. You know, I'm afraid. So every struggle for human rights and civil rights is one that we have to embrace fully. Because if we want that for ourselves, we have to want that for our neighbor and for our friend. So we have to build that solidarity as a way of really pushing back in this difficult time and give each other, you know, some sense of comfort too, because it's a very stressful time for many of the families that Ravi works with, that I represent or that I fight for. The sense of tension and despair is very real, and it's not waning anytime soon. All right. Perfect. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the conference here today.